Hi, my name is James, and I'm trying to express something that's kind of a difficult thing to express because, well, it's so complex, and at the same time, it's almost so dangerous that it's surreal, and that it's hard to believe, and that in itself is the problem. So let me make that a bit more concrete. The problem is there's a universal, massive identity crisis in the world, and it's leading to the destruction of humanity. And that is just such a huge idea. It's like why and how. Once you start to ask these questions, never mind coming up with an answer as to how do we fix it, it becomes very complicated very quickly and very intense. So naturally, it's easier to just be like, well, I don't accept that statement. There is no major identity crisis. Or if there is, it won't lead to the end of humanity. And yet we see the proof all around us of both. And people will say, yeah, I mean, there's an identity crisis for sure. And others will say, yeah, for sure, there's threat of the war, but never putting the two together, right? Could there be a nuclear winter next week? Absolutely. Everyone is on the same page right now because we see what's happening. There's the war, there's political chaos, there's pandemic and all that stuff. And of course, technology and how it's changing things, and there's just so much chaos. And everyone would say, yeah, for sure, that chaos is there, and we could very well end up blowing ourselves up. And on the other side, people could say, yeah, I can see why there's an identity crisis. I mean, people are fighting all over the place about everything, like, and I mean everything from religion, politics, identity, gender identity, feminism, Black Lives Matter, all that stuff. So, I mean, connecting the dots really doesn't take much of a leap in human imagination. If there's a lot of chaos with our identity, there's a lot of fighting and division, and there's a lot of war and problems in the world that we can't fix because we are not unified. I mean, it's clear. I mean, there's no, you know, there's no logical hurdle there. It's simple, it's clear cut. Um, and then once you realize, okay, yes, there's a massive identity crisis in the world, and it's leading to the destruction of humanity. Well, that simple idea that's so simple to understand is so surreal. It's more than real. At first, you're just like, well, I don't think the two connect. Then you say, yes, they do connect, but I can't believe that I'm living in a time and that where this is the case. So you sort of don't believe. When it's surreal, it's easy to just not believe in it, even though you know logically that this is what's happening. It's a strange one. Um, so why am I here talking in front of the camera? That's uh, that's a hard one to explain in a concise manner. But long story short, I've been thinking and studying many different things, and I've come to an understanding of many different things that isn't very common. Uh, my life has been a life of philosophy and of slipping through the cracks and understanding the world from multiple angles. It's just the way that it's the circumstances that happened, and it's just what happened in my life. out of my control. And it's uh, it's been kind of hard to put all these pieces together and then not express it in a way that could do some good and bring some good to the world. I've been doing it by writing. I've been doing it by passionately talking to my friends and to people that I meet. But I never actually do it in front of a camera, and that's a bit of ironic because I'm an actor and a storyteller, a filmmaker, and I have no problems being in front of the camera. But when it comes to this, it's so much more difficult because there's so much to say, and it is very personal to me as well. Um, so the fact that the world, you know, and all of its chaos, and where what people say is a good thing, empathy for the world, that is what I have, and it is very, very personal to me. Just like I think people think it is personal to them too when they subscribe to a certain movement. If you're into feminism, well, a woman on the other side of the planet, it's personal to you if she's going through some hardship. Or if you're Muslim and there's Muslims suffering in another country, that's personal to you. So things become personal even though, like, through identity, through community. And I've adapted to many different communities because I grew up very unstable. So it's personal on a whole other level for me. And this is why I've decided to talk about the mass identity crisis and how it leads to the destruction of humanity. So I'm going to begin with my personal life. I'm James, um, and I was born in Canada, so I'm from a small town in the peninsula of Gaspésie in Quebec. And my mother and my father, let me rephrase that. My biological father is quite violent, and by the age of 3, we were abused quite a bit, my mother, my sister, and I. So one of his friends noticed the situation we were in, and he decided to help us out of the situation. So we escaped. We went to another city, and he found us there, and we had troubles and stuff. So we had to go further away, and we ended up in another province. We went to Toronto. And so my life started out quite unstable. And the first place that I went to, Toronto, is like almost like China in comparison to the little town that I'm from where all my family is. And so that essentially means I was estranged. I was exiled in a way from my own family. So I didn't grow up with my family. I don't know. I have plenty of cousins, aunts, uncles, you know, grandparents, like a massive family I never really got to know from growing up in Toronto. And of course, being in Toronto, it's you know, in itself is a bit of a mess because it's like all these different cultures coming together. No one's really from Toronto in a sense. Everyone sort of moves there. And yeah, it's kind of difficult to integrate sometimes. Now, I love multiculturalism. I celebrate it. I'm very much passionate about cultures, but there's a lot of clashing there too. So it's there's so many different things that happened growing up in Toronto, and that really messed with my identity even more. So now we're starting to get into identity and on a personal level, on an individual level, but it's relevant to identity on a collective level in terms of humanity, because I mean, a society is composed of individuals. So there seems to be a, a link there, and this is why I'm giving you my personal story. So that's how I started out my life, but it wasn't over. I was bullied in school, so we moved to different schools. Some schools, because we were poor, we went to poor schools, and there was like lice in one of them. I got lice 2, 3 times that year. We had to go to another school. Um, and Also my mother moving around for work, different places, so we had to go to different schools. We moved to many different neighborhoods and different houses, different apartments, that kind of stuff, basements, whatever. Um, and at some point, different cities and different provinces as well. I lived in, growing up, I lived in three different provinces, probably three or four different cities, and many, many different apartments, different houses, different schools, private school, public school, French immersion school, Catholic school, homeschool, adult school, which is a school that helps, like 18, 19-year-olds kind of catch up and 22-year-olds, that age when you're starting to get too old to be to high school to help you get your degree. Um, Online school, I did it all. And so that was quite chaotic. And so different living in different communities, going to different schools, all that stuff, it messes with your identity because you're not integrating anything that has to do with identity into who you are. Um, what most people kind of take for granted or aren't even aware is something incredibly important in life. I had no access to, in a sense. Sometimes I had no access to communities, and sometimes I had access, but I was ripped away from them very quickly. So that causes a couple of different things. One, it caused me to want to adapt, obviously. So, I'm always the new guy in school or whatever, and I was always trying to understand things. Like, okay, well, maybe if I can understand this community, this group of friends, whatever, whether it was the sporty kids or the hip hop kids or the anime kids or the geeks or the whatever, if I could understand them and mimic them, then maybe they'll accept me and maybe I'll, become something. And I mean, normally that's what happens. I mean, you go to a new environment and you'll eventually sort of take on and adapt and that's it. But when you're constantly forced to do that, you realize, well, there is an identity forming in you, and it's one that is a collection of different values, different identities, and it makes you more individualistic. And so even if you feel that you've adapted to a community, they will never really truly accept you as one of their own. There's always going to be a sense of, well, yeah, you're one of us, but there's something about you that's different, in comparison to us. So that kind of gets reflected back at you, and it's always in your face. And it's not like people do it on purpose. They have no choice. It's just true because when you're an adaptable person, you're not going to behave the same way that your community behaves because you know that there's different way to behave. There's different ways to do things, and to adapt in those different ways will help. So there are benefits and there are hardships. That's one of the benefits. You can adapt, which is great. You can experience different cultures. You can see between the lines. You can see things that other people don't see. You can understand people more. You start to have insights that others don't. Um, but on the flip side, it causes massive identity crisis. It's in hindsight now, it's okay, but in the process of it, this is very painful. I mean, you to grow up and you don't have that friend that you grew up with, you know, since we were 5 years old, that lifelong friend. To not have a hockey team that you root for your entire life or something like this. To not have um, a school where you have the same mentors, your teachers, really mentored you throughout your whole school career, 13, 14 years of elementary and secondary school. You don't have that. You don't have any, connection to even a culture, right? Because it was just me, my mother, and my sister. And we weren't in Quebec with the Quebec culture, Quebec mentality the whole time. We were exposed to, people from all over the world, from Africa, from Europe, from Asia. Um, So we take on different values, and you start to become confused. Well, who am I? And then you do different things. You try to integrate one thing, but all those things that you're integrating, they seem very conflicting. How can you reconcile those things? Right? I mean, if I grew up, in the ghetto, so if you're part of the ghetto, and it's cool to listen to rap and to go, and some of my friends would literally go and beat people up in the street and just steal their money. It's like cool to do crime, but then you're also part of the geeks, and it's all about just enjoying anime and all that, and it seems kind of dinky to the rap community, but you enjoy both, and it's just very conflicting, and you end up a bit of a loner, and then you start to think you're weird, and because you are a little bit weird in a sense, just because you're not like everyone else. Um, you start to feel weird and you start to behave even more weird than you normally would be, and so this is a self-reinforcing cycle, and then it really estranges you even more, and it's like, phew, tough. So one of my self-defense mechanisms was to try to understand the world. If I could understand how communities work, how reality works, how science works, how politics works, how philosophy, you know, maybe I can have control, right? And that's a problem because, well, you don't have control. That's an illusion. You can't control things simply by understanding them. You have to have the capability to execute something. You have to have the virtues. You have to have patience, consistency. You have to have know-how to change things. But what are you going to do? Even if you cultivate those things to change the world, are you going to go and change the world directly? And change it to what? Makes no sense. How is the pursuit of creating an identity for yourself, you know, relevant to changing the world? There's all these things, but that's what happened. I became a brainiac. And another downside was fear of commitment, fear of being hurt. You're integrating somewhere, and then all of a sudden, poof, you're ripped away. I'll give you an example. First thing that I really felt was bringing me purpose and meaning, taking part in a community, was being an altar boy. My mother fell in love with the priest, and the priest fell in love with her, and there was this drama there, and the church, because it's Roman Catholic, did not like that, and he decided to choose the church. And so they persecuted my mother, and one way to persecute her for being in love with this priest was to persecute me. They kicked me out of being an altar boy. I was crushed. And I eventually did cadets, and I had a car accident with the military cadets at some point. And I was depressed. It triggered depression for me and anxiety because, it was a major accident. And I was slouching in the rank. I was standing, behind. I was a higher rank at that point, so I was behind the platoon and I was slouching, and I just didn't care anymore, and the officer pulled me out, and he was quite rough with me. He said, if you're not going to be doing things properly, you can go home. Come back when you feel. I told him, I don't know, I'm just going through some shit since the accident. But they're not mental health experts, and the military is not really all about taking care of your mental health that much. So it's just go and come back when you're good. And I didn't come back, and I felt crushed. Again, I just didn't, I wasn't encouraged to come back more than that. So, fear of commitment and fear of being hurt is a major thing. It creates trust issues. And so I had to overcome that too. And then, of course, not having a father in my life to help me through all that identity crisis. Now we're starting to get into other levels of community. We're talking about the very first one, family, right? When you don't have family, well, I mentioned it earlier, I guess, but I didn't have a father, I didn't have family to identify with, I didn't have a school to identify with, I didn't have any teams to identify with, I didn't have, anything really. And even religion, I couldn't identify with it. I became atheist. So now I'm sort of losing the train of thought, but the point is, I began to create different identities for myself, and I was fractured. And when it didn't work, I decided to abuse alcohol. I was drinking, 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 and it was to numb the emotional pain and the pain really, the result of not having an identity is you don't love yourself because you don't know who you are anyway. You have no self-love. There's nowhere to generate self-love. And so, you begin to brainwash people around you, making them believe, like when I was in a romantic relationship, well, you don't actually love me because I couldn't feel the love, in the relationship. And it was really because I didn't love myself, but I couldn't face that fact. It was too painful. It was so subconscious that I made them believe, no, you're the one who doesn't love me. And it's just, it messes with your relationships. It messes with everything. Identity is incredibly important, which is why people are grasping onto all these movements. And we're going to get to that in a second. But the point is, the result of not having a community to orient you and to integrate an identity with, it makes you see many things, it makes you understand many things, but it brings you a lot of pain. And so it became very personal to me uh, when I realized that the world is having an identity crisis. I recognize it in such an intimate way, um, because we have multiple levels, as I mentioned. You have like, communities are there's various circles, various levels, and they all overlap. You have family, then you have your local community, the people around you. You have your school, workplace. You have your country, religion, culture, language. These are all communities. If you share a language with someone, you're a different community, right? So I was a French Canadian, and living in an English part, and an English part, but in Toronto with like Africans and in African neighborhoods and other neighborhoods and stuff like that, different cultures at different times. All this stuff um, are different communities. So I was hopping from different community to different community. And then there's religious community, and also that brings people together as well. You can have Indonesia is Muslim, just like Saudi Arabia is Muslim and all that, and that brings them together, even though they're completely different cultures. So that's what I mean by overlap. And and so it's kind of an amazing thing that humans come together and create stories, and they have things that they value and structures that that communities can center themselves around in order to integrate the individual, so that the individual can feel, so it's this is why it's so important to individuals to be like, yeah, here's who I am, right? I want the world to reflect this at the world, and I want the world to reflect it back at me so that I can secure me in my identity. I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan from, let's say, Vancouver, BC, and I'm French Canadian. I'm this. I'm that. And you have this whole list that you create, and you try to represent it, and you try to be it. That's why we dress certain ways. It's why we talk certain ways. It's why we do certain things. It's why we go certain places. It's why we eat certain things. It's why we date certain people. It's why we. It's like identity is so intrinsic to everything about us. It's no wonder that people are so obsessed with uh, different things, movements, right? And well, why? That's a major question. I have my cat here. I have to let him in. Come on, let's fish. Let's fish. Go. So, why now? The question, why? I'm going to close this. Why are people using identity? Like, why is it so important, other than the reasons that I've just explained, that, it helps you integrate? But, like, why integrate? Why do we need to know who we are, what we are, which is a different question. Most of the time, we're obsessed with who am I, never what I am. Well, I'll get to that later. So, who I am, once you have all these communities together, you answer the question. It's this list that you've created. But that's not enough. Because then you think, well, who, like, what are those things, right? People want to know, like, well, what's the reason for me being around? So it's another thing. It's like, okay, well, I know who I am, but why am I around? What's the purpose, right? So it's what we have religions for. And if you're not religious, then you believe in scientific, you believe in nature, but people always believe in something. There's got to be a reason. Um, and if your reason is very abstract, like, well, it's just existence has always existed, it's an infinity of existence, and nature popped up out of nowhere, and the purpose is to evolve, and that's it. If that satisfies you, it satisfies you. But the point is, it's easy to be satisfied by these abstract answers and all that when you have integrated an identity, right? So it's kind of like all these communities and these structures allow us to be integrated up here, and it floats on these like abstract questions that we're not really sure, and we don't want to go near it. We just say, yeah, that's what I believe. So yeah, I believe God created it, and that's it. Or I believe nature is nature, and it just popped out of nowhere, and that's it. We don't want to touch it too much because it brings us existential crisis. It starts to unravel, in other words, the identities that we've created for ourselves. Because we feel like, okay, well, how do I justify all that? And is it true? Is it true that that's who I am? Well, a lot of people don't want to, they just live simpler than that. They don't think about it. They are who they are, and that's good for them. I'm not saying, I mean, that's not a good or a bad thing. Um, because I know what it's like to have the opposite, right? And it's tough. So, how does this apply to the world now? Let's start with our religions, because we explained identity, identity crisis, how it manifests itself in the individual, um, and all that, and what it rests on, which is these existential questions. Well, humanity is having an identity crisis because of these existential questions. We're being faced with these existential questions in a ways that we perhaps have never had to face them before. Massive questions that need answers now. Like, where do we come from? Why? Um, what is the purpose of things? Like, what is truly moral? Is truth objective or subjective? Right? All these things, we need answers to these things now, and I'll explain why. Because we've always needed answers, and we always have answered these questions in certain ways, but now we're hard pressed to answer them and come up with proof and come up with ways that we can reconcile a lot of the paradoxes that pop up, and to try to draw a larger circle around humanity so that we can all believe in the same thing, be on the same page, create a new identity for humanity that can unify us. So let's explain how that works in history. When humans evolved, we became more aware, more conscious. We started understanding our mortality, that we can die. We understood time, that there is future, and that what we do in the present can impact the future. So these little things that we became aware of, it led us to a lot of these big questions, like, okay, well, why? Now, that's another thing, right? We became aware of purpose. Why does everything exist? How did it get created? These are not things that animals really ask themselves that we know of. So the higher the degree of complexity of consciousness, the higher, or the greater the questions will be, and the harder the answers will be to come by. So when we evolved and we started asking those questions, well, we immediately started creating stories to come up with explanations, right? And these stories are based on our environments, what we noticed around us. So we looked up at the stars, we noticed the sun. Worship of the sun is the most worshipped god in history, because the sun comes up and we know it keeps us warm and we can see everything, and we notice that plants grow when the sun is out and all this stuff. So it's abundant, it has power and everything. So it made sense. We worshipped nature, we worshipped everything around us, and that's called animism. Animism, I don't know if the word has etymological roots to the word animated, maybe, or anima, which I think is a Latin word for, I forget. But the point is, nature was God, right? in the sense everything was God. There was spirits in the water, in the trees, everything, things that moved, things were alive. We recognized that there's a force behind things. What today we could just call energy, right? There's energy, photosynthesis in plants, electromagnetism, X-rays, lights, all that. These are forces of nature, and it's true. So it's kind of amazing how they were very simple and they didn't think about things, and but we began to create stories to explain these forces and how they work, right? What was lightning? Oh, it was some god that was angry and whatever. So we created these stories to build gods out of nature. And the more sophisticated these stories became, the more different animism became. It evolved. It evolved into something called polytheism, believing that there's multiple gods. Because animism was more like a force behind things, and they are kind of spirits, but they're not gods. They're you recognize them, and you take part in that world too. You are a force, and you recognize that other force, or that other animal, or that plant, or whatever. And it still exists today. The Native Americans are like this. Animism, Shintoism in Japan is a similar concept. There's a spirit behind the world, and you don't really turn it into a god, but you honor it and you live in accordance to it. But polytheism is more that where the storytelling comes in and starts to explain why those forces are there and why they behave and what kind of characteristics of these behaviors. So we create an identity for these forces, what we call gods. And so this identity um, kind of justifies our own. I exist because God created me, right? This God created me, and then this is the God that will kill me, the God of death, and this is the God that brings me what I need and whatever. So that's polytheism. We believe in multiple gods, and they all have a certain role to play in your life, and that brings us more comfort and more answers as to what reality is and what we're here to do, and that's it. Eventually, we evolved and we became more sophisticated. We developed agriculture, and this agriculture um, type of civilization made it so that we had to live in one place. We were no longer nomadic, and it created different effects. It made it so that a lot of people could do just one thing. You didn't have to, in one day go and get water and hunt an animal and then forage for vegetables and put it all together and then, make your own coat. People kind of did a little bit of everything and it was shared, but you had multiple tasks. But then it became, no, all I can do is just plow the soil. And this person just puts the seeds in the soil, right? And then there's some people who are in charge of just guarding the town, make sure no one steals the grain. So it created a specialization, and it created a different mode of living, and it created a different type of community, right? It created a community that was bigger. In nomadic tribes, you can't really have a nomadic tribe of 5,000 people and they're all moving from place to place so that their cattle can graze. It's too big. So when we developed agriculture, it allowed us to live in bigger communities, but we didn't evolve really well to do that. Now, you could say that we are still evolving in a sense, and religion is what helps us evolve to be able to live with greater religions or greater communities, sorry, with more people. So at some point when, two tribes kind of came into contact with each other and they realized, well, you have a different God, it didn't come into their mind that that tribe's God was false or didn't exist because they knew very well there's multiple gods. So they just encountered new gods and maybe they were scared of them and say, well, no, ours is, better and it'll beat yours or whatever. Or they'll accept it, like, oh, cool, yeah, we didn't know about that God, right? So it's a little bit more less antagonistic. But the problem is when you have greater communities and they start to fight over, what it is we're supposed to behave like together. Oh yeah, well my God says this and well my God says that. Well, then we start to run into some problems. And this is where monotheism comes in, right? Or at the very least religion, meaning we select a certain cadre of gods and this is how they all function. This is what they say and they create a coherent story so that we can resolve the conflicts that we have together. And we have to believe in this religion and this religion only, because if we allow other religions, that they come into conflict, and that's bad. Hence why people killed each other, and still do, for not having the same belief, because it creates a stability for the community. It might oppress the individual, but it creates stability for the community. Okay, great. And so it's a bit of like a software for the hardware of humanity. At some point, monotheism came along because it just did that. It says, okay, well now there's all these these religions. I'm gonna create one religion. I'm gonna make it even more simple. So that's what Constantine did. He didn't create the religion, but he saw that the idea of monotheism, meaning there's only one God, made it even, let's say, more efficient to create cohesion among peoples. And so the Christianity became the religion of ancient Rome at that point, and that there you go. It creates a new level of cohesion. But the irony is that as much as the monotheistic religions think they're monotheistic, they have an element of polytheism always. They can't escape it. Um, you know, you think about Christianity, you have Jesus Christ, who is what? God the Father and the Holy Spirit. That's three gods in a sense. Or they say one God, but three forms of one God. That sounds a lot like Hinduism, right? Same thing. They all the polytheistic religions already have that notion that there is one force, and out of that force there is a multiplicity of gods, or different faces of that one God, right? So monotheism is the same in that sense. And this is why people end up worshiping more than just one God, even in a monotheistic religion. They don't see it that way because they're like, well, it's not a God, it's an angel, or it's a saint, or it's Mother Mary. They're not gods, but they're what if not gods? They're still divine, they're not human. And it still goes against the concept that you're supposed to only worship one God, right? So monotheism and polytheism really, the reason it that polytheists also believe in one force and that monotheists also believe in many forces, um, is because of, in philosophy we call this the problem. It's not really a problem if you understand it, but the problem of duality, right? If you have one thing, is that one thing composed of two other things, right? What is the fundamental thing that you can't divide? And this is the basis of truth. We try to understand and prove what is true based on finding one fundamental principle. In nature, the way we do that is through science, by trying to understand the fundamental force. Is there a unifying force that brings everything into being, or at least reconciles everything? And so in religion, that force is God, the God. So it doesn't matter how you look at it. We need to identify with a certain truth that will justify everything else about our communities and about how we live our lives. And today, that is being eroded in a massive way. And this isn't new. This began a while back. Now, there's always been atheists and stuff like that, but generally, the consistency of religions and identity has been quite stable. And there's instabilities here and there when empires start to form and all this. But generally speaking, we've always been able to find a new story to identify with things, right? Harari says that the new story of the 21st century was capitalism and liberalism, and that the marriage between the two was the sort of the new story. And it's true, it is a bit of a religion, right? If you think about it, the customer is always right. It's like a law. It's like the golden rule or something like that. When it comes to capitalism, you know what's best. The pursuit of happiness, right? Leave it up to the individual to dictate what's happy. That's liberalism. So these tenets that we live by, these religion, even that is being eroded and crumbling, according to Harari. And I think it makes sense because of technology. When technology knows you better than you know yourself, that messes with your identity in a big way. If I don't even know what I want and the algorithm knows better than I want, well then what religion do I have, or what do I subscribe to, like ideology? How can I identify with something that brings me structure? Now you start to feel like you're a slave to something, or that you can't identify with something that has complete power over you, which is why all of our gods have typically given us free will. But we no longer believe in free will, right? Neuroscience proves or tries to prove that we don't actually have free will, and they have proven at the level of the brain to some degree. But it's a philosophical discussion that we could have. The point is, everything about reality and all the structures that help us create an identity for ourselves is crumbling. If we don't have free will, if liberalism, capitalism don't work, if religions are false and they're bad for you and they just cause harm because people kill each other, if the world is globalizing and we have to sort of subscribe to one global culture, and it eliminates the diversity of cultures in that sense. But at the same time, we want diversity, and and there's a conflict there. We want different ideas and different people and different music and all that. And yet we realize, well, we're trying to create a stability, so we need a global culture at the same time. But is a global culture erasing different cultures? And if it's erasing different cultures, it's erasing identity. So this is a major problem on multiple fronts. Major problem. So how do you fix it? We need to come up with a new story, a new mythos, a new god, in other words. How are we going to do that? Because right now, people think that the best way to go about it is to create new gods. People don't think that. They're not aware that that's what they're doing, but that's what they're doing. When you subscribe to gender identity, right? Transgenderism, what do you think that is? That is an identitarian movement, identity politics in general. I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican. I'm white, no, or I'm black, or I'm an ally, or I'm trans, gender fluid, or I'm a feminist, or I'm a male activist, or I'm a this, I'm a that. What they call intersectionality. I'm a cross between all those things. It's this list, and we seek validation. But this validation, it rests on nothing, and it decays real quick. It's a self-eating snake. Why? Because you cannot create an identity directly. You cannot say my identity without truth, especially. And people, that's the new ideology, right? Postmodernism. It's this idea that truth is all relative. Subjective truth is really the only truth that exists. So if anything is true at any time, like, oh, I am who I am and this is what I feel like today and all this, then there's no cohesion. There's no objective truth that sets a standard by which we can cooperate. It's about tyranny. It's about I get to tyrannize you and you get to tyrannize me. You have to see life and behave life the way I see it. And I have to do the same to you. Well, obviously that breaks down. So then you both do what? Well, you both agree with the ideology that you subscribe to. But what is that ideology? Right? That ideology is the same thing. It's just subjective. And so that's why you see movements like feminism like fractionates, right? You see things like there's a trans man. So it was a woman who became a man. She was white, and she applied to be the director of this non-profit organization to help trans people, and to be director. And they didn't allow her to apply. Didn't want her to be, or him to be, a director, because he was a white man now, and white men are at the bottom of the hierarchy of values. So you're creating this value, this hierarchy that is so weak and that crumbles so quick. So it makes no sense anymore. So then you have to create a new group, a new religion. So now we're going to need. So that's why you have, for example, the TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, right? Feminism was supposed to be about women, but then anything can be a woman, anyone can be a woman. So now we have to include everyone. So feminism doesn't really exist, but yeah, it does, because it's whatever anyone says a woman is, and so there's complete chaos. identity and people are grasping at anything that can bring them validation. Um, and that's what religions used to offer, traditional ones anyway. And that's why some people are going radically, they're going straight into religion to, you know, to make up for that need that they're not getting, for that chaos. They're looking for that order that religion can provide. But those religions aren't providing much order anymore either. So, like, it's it started really when Nietzsche came out. He predicted that God is dead, meaning we killed God, and that this was going to cause massive problems, and that never really went away. That's why we had a 21st century was bloody, like it was horrible, and the religion that we came up with was capitalism, and it won. It won over communism, and now we're having that fight again. And so, but now we also have technology that's coming into the mix, you know. So technology is changing what it means to be human. So we have all of that. We have all that complicated stuff that we're subscribing to. We no longer have a grasp on truth. Therefore, we can't create any structures by which we can identify ourselves with, much less unifying ones. They're all fractionating ones. So you have like different groups and they split off. Um, well, ultimately it leaves a vacuum for what we need, and what we need is to fulfill our religiosity. So now humans may not always be religious, but they have religiosity. It'll always lead them back to being religious at some point. What is religiosity? What's the need for community? It's the need for having an identity. It's the need for purpose. It's the need for morality, ritual, right? All these things that religions fulfill. You're gonna find it somewhere. That's why you have Black Lives Matter. They kneel, right? They kneel. They do these symbols. They have symbols. They do things like a show of be like being allies, right? You wear certain symbols. You come together. It's all about it's all about fulfilling an identity. But these movements are clearly, you know, not equipped to explain and bring unifying sort of like mythos. So, it does provide people with meaning because I can be a social activist and that's my purpose in life, and that breaks down real fast. So, okay, now I'm just kind of getting messy, but put all of that aside, and now we have an even greater problem that fuels all of that, and it's technology, which is the fact that it is exponential, meaning it gets faster and faster to the degree that it's changing what it means to be human. Today, we think about cyborgs as being this kind of like half person, half machine, but we are. I mean, your phone is literally making you a machine because you have access to all of the knowledge on the human. 40 years ago, if you wanted to know something, 50 years ago, if you wanted to know something, you go online, I guess, but let's say 70 years ago, you had to go to a library. Now, so anything you want to know, you can know at the tap of a couple of buttons. And this technology is getting more and more integrated, right? So before, we had to go to a library. Then we got the internet and computers. Then you had to go to the computer that was plugged in the wall at home. Now it's on you at all times on your phone. Then we're going to have it on our glasses. And at some point, we're already working on brain-to-computer interfaces. You'll be able to upload and download information and surf the web directly from your mind. So it's becoming more ubiquitous, more integrated. It's changing who we are as human beings. It's fucking with our identity in a massive way. Who are we if like, what does it mean to date? What does love mean if you can swipe, swipe, swipe and have different algorithms that tell you what kind of person you should be dating and all this kind of stuff? What does it mean to be a human if now we're including our tools in such an intimate way? What are we going to become? What are we? is another question. It starts to give us that question. We already can't answer who we are and why we exist and how we should come together and what the story of humanity is. We have a problem there. Now we're changing. We're changing. It's like, what are we? We're becoming something completely different. Talk about identity crisis. Talk about identity crisis. We don't know what the job market's going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years because technology is changing things. So is it good to teach children coding? Fuck yeah, yeah, that's what we say now. It's all about being on the computer. But then once that runs out and things change, now computers can change their own algorithms and improve themselves, then what? Humans are going to have to face who they are even more. They have to come up with a new story and a new identity for who they are. All of this creates so much chaos. It creates an immense confusion. It creates division and fighting and wars because we have no identity. We're reaching what some in the scientific community, more specifically physicists, call the great filter. I'll explain what that is. The great filter is essentially it's the transition from a type 0 to a type 1 civilization. And physicists have come up with a scale, the Kardashev scale, that measures the progress of humanity in the universe. And this Kardashev fellow felt that energy consumption was the best way to measure the progress of humanity. So, type 0 is using the energy of dead plants, oil, gas, and so on. When you control the energy of your entire planet and the home star, you become a type 1 civilization. If you can control the energy of the galaxy and all that, you become kind of like in Star Wars, you become a type 2. If you can do interstellar travel, go to different galaxies and you know, and even more power when it comes to energy consumption, you become type 3. And so I think there's like 5, 6 types, and that's more like Star Trek, right? So a type 0 to type 1 is the most chaotic out of all the transitions because we still have to deal with scarcity of energy and we're globalizing and we have all these identity crises going on. Like I said, that's what happens when you globalize. I'll give you a small example. I was living in Vancouver and there the inflation is so high because you have a lot of Koreans coming in and Chinese that invest because the housing market was really good there. So they would just buy these condos, not rent them out to anyone. They didn't want the responsibility of finding tenants and all that stuff. It was just an investment because 5 years later they could just resell it, 30% profit, bye bye. And this just kept going. So the people who were renting out, well, they noticed that the demand was high and so they could up their prices. So, you know, people like students that I saw, they lived in fucking closets for $700, sometimes $1,100 a month in Vancouver. Creates a gentrification. People get pissed off at the Chinese and then the government, and then it creates chaos, right? That's what happens when you globalize. It's just a small example. Clashing ideologies of you know, when people visit each other's countries, can you adapt to how we live? Can all that stuff, the economic impacts, the personal impacts to health, technology, all that stuff, right? Look at how many teenage girls are killing themselves because of the identity issue, right? Who am I, and am I beautiful enough, and all this, and self-image because of all these filters that they use. We are in a type 0 to type 1 transition. And since we've had the nuclear bomb in the 40s, late 40s, we have the power to kill off humanity like that. And we have a war right now. We have a war. We have the ability to that we have an ability to kill humanity, to like destroy ourselves, and we are at the turn of a massive transition of humanity. So to finish it off, they call it the Great Filter because they explain that they think people believe that perhaps the reason we don't see life in the universe is because of this how chaotic this transition is from type 0 to type 1. So they call it the Great Filter. It filters out how many societies or life forms can actually make it past the chaos of spreading into the universe, right? Of being able to integrate. So literally, it it is all about identity. If we do not come up with a unifying story that will unify human beings, that we can all believe in the same thing and connect together, to work together, to fix the problems we have instead of fighting over the problems we have and trying to to survive and do anything at all costs. For me, my group, it will literally lead to the death of humanity. It could be any day like this. It could change. We're just so not used to it. We acclimate so quickly to things. But it could be today. There could be bombs going off, and then over the next 2 months, you start to have nuclear winter. The internet goes down, food shortages. I'm in Tunisia at the moment. The gas is cut off at the moment. You know, we have sugar and big water bottles. No more water in the country last month. People had to boil water at home. We're in it now. We're in it. We have massive pandemic that just happened, insane culture war in the Western world for the last, say, 7, 8 years. Massive ecological problems with, climate change and pollution. We have, this war in Ukraine, nuclear capabilities, all resting on this identity crisis that can't really allow us to move forward to find common ground, to connect together so we can overcome these problems. So what's the solution? Right? This is all problems. This is all one massive problem. This is the apocalypse. This is like the dire, crazy, it might sound like a conspiracy, most pessimistic story, right? But it's real. We're in it. It's not what I call the apocalypse paradox anymore, which is, do you create the apocalypse by talking about it, or do you actually, like, do you create the probability that it will happen, or do you deflate the possibility that the apocalypse will happen by discussing it so that people are aware and all that? If you discuss the apocalypse, maybe people become aware, oh yeah, we have to be careful, and then it slows down. Or by talking about it, it makes people nervous and they behave in ways that are really bad, like they get nervous and they hoard things and they get angry at other people and they try to force their ideology to make sure there's peace, and it creates the conditions for an apocalypse. This paradox right now, it doesn't even matter. I mean, it's a massive problem to try to solve, but it doesn't even matter now. I think now there's a runaway effect, an escape velocity, where there's enough chaos that talk about it, don't talk about it, doesn't matter. The chaos is taking root. Can an order form before we destroy ourselves? It all depends on if we come up with a story. And now that's why we have all these religions and public intellectuals. They're coming out, they're saying different things. People are attaching themselves to it, they're identifying with it, and it's very good. But there are multiple ones. There isn't one syncretic religion, right, that unifies even all of those people. What we've called the intellectual dark web at some point, which is public intellectuals coming up and talking about values and truth and so on. So we're getting there. There is an order that's trying to emerge. Can we do it in time before we kill ourselves is the question. What will happen first? We don't know. But I felt compelled to explain that, and the truth is I do have an answer. I do have a worldview that reconciles everything because, like I said, my personal journey of identity crisis led me to trying to understand the world. Then I understand, well, I have to understand myself. Understanding the world isn't enough. Who am I in relation to that world that I understand? But it led me to trying to reconcile everyone, all the points of view. And I think I'll create a second video for that. But the point is, a philosophy emerged from me, and it 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 comes up with some answers that I believe could be very helpful in unifying humanity, and it was a very hard one to admit and to try to say because it sounds crazy, and I thought I was crazy for the longest time. But ultimately, whether I am or I'm not, I think I'll feel better about having offered what I can offer, um, and I hope I've at least opened some eyes, and yeah. So I'll make a video about my worldview and how I think it can reconcile this massive identity crisis so that we can reduce the chances of us destroying humanity. Thanks for listening.